The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Keep your mission on your mind and your mind on your mission. This is Mission Minded with Michael Coleman.
It is a show that keeps your mission in your mind and your mind your mission. That's why it's called Mission Minded. He's the executive director of the Jimmie Hale Mission and a very dear friend of mine, Michael Coleman, joins us every single week. We talk about non-for-profits, how to get started. We talk about mission statements. We talk about everything, the money aspect of it. Michael, how you doing, man? What's going on?
Could not be better. Love serving in the nonprofit world and love helping other people understand how to navigate that space. So just glad to be here.
I think it's interesting, too, because it's springtime now. We just had Easter. This show is going to air after Easter, and happy Easter to you. But what's Jimmie Hale Mission's clientele look like, numbers-wise, because we're going to talk about the ebbs and flows of non-for-profits. But what's it look like from a season standpoint? I know around the holidays when it's colder and obviously more people want to be around other people and sharing the spirit of Jesus Christ and everything else. But like springtime, what is Jimmie Hale Mission? Or does it look any different at all? Is it just a day-to-day situation?
Seasonally, it doesn't matter where we are in terms of our clientele. Now, as with most nonprofits, the end of year is huge because that's when lots of times people give their large tax-deductible gifts. And so we get, in November and December, we get probably 50% of our budget for the year in those 2 months.
Wow.
So those are big fundraising focuses. Because we're also a faith-based mission, this time around Easter is usually a very good fundraising month for us. And it's just a time when people start to reflect on what is my responsibility as a community member, how blessed we are individually. We start focusing on, well, how can I bless others? And lots of times you start looking around for organizations that can be trusted. And this is in every community. And so you find that one and you're like, hey, I want to give of myself. I want to make somebody's life better. And so that's how that you have things that spur those things on special times of the year. Otherwise, our probably our worst fundraising months are January because you've just come out of a huge giving season.
Yeah.
And then the summertime because, look, let's just be honest, that's when families with children, they're focused on just surviving the summer with their kids. They go on vacations. They've set aside money for those things. And so giving to organizations at that time is just typically not their top priority. So we understand we're going to have some downtimes like that. But in terms of clientele, ours stay pretty consistent throughout the year.
This is Mission Minded. It airs every single Wednesday at noon and 7 here on Tony Kurre Radio and, of course, Tony Kurre Radio Live. And then, of course, you can go back and listen to all the episodes on our Spotify podcast platform in partnership with those fine folks. It's great. Just search Tony Kurre Radio on Spotify, and you can see all the episodes and go listen to as many as you want with Michael Coleman, the executive director of Jimmie Hale Mission. Before we get into our numbers and the main focus of our show today, to protect the anonymity of certainly your clientele, do you see ebbs and flows in your male and female numbers? I know you have Jesse's Place and obviously your New Men's Center. And when you see a spike, gender-wise, does it raise an eyebrow for you? Does it tell you anything?
Well, we, in the past, so we're going through a transition right now where we have transitioned the men already to what we believe is just a top-of-the-line, dynamic addiction recovery program that lasts 4 months. And of course, we continue to provide care for people who do not have a place to go back to at the end of those 4 months. So we have a continuing care program where we transition them into living wage employment. And here in Alabama, we're counting that as $15 an hour or higher. And we've had great success and our program's done very well. Jesse's Place was a little bit different. Jesse's Place was kind of formed that was not built around addiction. That was at one time built more around homeless care when women didn't have to have children, but if they had children, we could provide stable housing for you until your situation got better. But the reality is, at least in Birmingham, we found out that there's just not a huge demand typically for our for our services. And it doesn't mean that there's not people who need it, but lots of times people are not willing to come into a shelter environment and adhere to rules. Mm-hmm. So they may be there, but they're not willing to come to that. And this is just one of the things about poverty that you learn. It's just one of those one of these rules that come into play. Because people in poverty live in the moment, and that's usually necessitated by the fact that they put one fire out and then they turn around and go to the next fire. So they live in the day, the present. They call us oftentimes, and I'm just going to throw out a hypothetical. Let's say a girlfriend gets thrown out of her house by her boyfriend, and she's out there on the street with a child or two. So she's in panic mode. So she calls us and we tell her, okay, we can't do intake till in the morning, but be here at 8:00 in the morning. Well, because she's living in the moment, she's in panic mode now. She's reaching out to us. If she connects with a family member or a friend who will put them up, then once that anxiety goes away, then she won't show up for intake. So it's not uncommon. It was not uncommon at the time. We would get 10 people. We'd have 10 scheduled intakes and one person show up. And just research shows, because once the crisis passes, even though that crisis, even though when it passed, the solution to that is not a long-term solution, that they live in the moment. So in the moment, I don't need your services, so I'm not going to come use you. That doesn't mean next week I'm not going to call you in an emergency state again. That's one of the challenges when we've tried to lift people out of poverty, is help them look down the road and look towards future stabilization, and to not just live in the moment. And what was necessary for us to do is kind of wrap our arms around these people and say, hey, it's okay to take your eyes off what's right in front of you, because we're here. We're going to be your safety net for you while you transition to that. But you can't navigate life if you're only living in the moment.
I think that is so astute and so important. And it's the first time I've really heard it, because when you live in poverty, you may be an addict, you may be drinking too much, you may be smoking cigarettes. You're doing things that obviously at your social economic level you cannot afford. And a lot of people are like, well, why are you doing all these different things to be vices? It's because they are living in the moment. Life is too big. It's overwhelming. They can't handle it right now. And so what do? They try to find an escape. They try to find something to get them out of that moment, until they obviously put their feet back on the ground the next day or 2 days or 3 days later and find themselves in the same position, correct? I mean, and I think that's why a lot of people can't quite understand, well, if you can't afford to do these things, then why do you do these things? It's just getting through a lot. That's right. A lot of times it's like getting through the day.
Well, I spend a lot of my time speaking to church groups, civic organizations, Rotary, Kiwanis, all that, to help them understand something that I had to learn several years ago. And I learned it by a woman named Dr. Ruby Payne. If anybody wants to reach out to her network, she's written several books, but she wrote a book called A Framework for Understanding Poverty. And it really transformed my understanding. And I'll just kind of walk you through this real quick, because I think it's really important for the audience to understand this. So she has a chart in that book that talks about the hidden rules of class systems. And so you have poverty class, and then she's got 10 items, and she says, here's the general rule of poverty class. Now, there's a distinction. It's very important to understand that the class system, whether you're middle class or whether you're poverty class, you have general rules that are taught. Now, there's specific cultural issues. So you could have Black poverty, you could have white poverty, and you could have Hispanic poverty. The overall rules are the same. What's different is, culturally speaking, is how those rules manifest themselves, but the rules themselves. So let me give you two quick examples. So take the issue of time. As I said before, poverty only lives in the present. Mm-hmm. The middle class, we are taught to consider the future. So for instance, this is an example. I want to have a good life. I want to be able to take care of myself. I want to be able to make X amount of dollars, whatever. Therefore, I understand now that I need to go to college or school or receive some type of training that gives me the skills I need. So therefore, I'm doing something today not because it benefits me in the now, but I'm addressing it in the later. I learned this from my mother, who would sit down and have a stack of bills, and she would be writing checks to pay those bills. And she would say, Michael, we have to pay, we owe this money. And that's the other issue I'm going to talk to you about, is money.
Yeah.
Money has to be managed. That's the rule of the middle class. And so she would sit down and pay her bills. And if there was money left over, great, we might get to do something. But if no money was left over, we paid those bills first. She kept the lights on. She did all that. And we basically sucked on green beans for a couple of weeks. I mean, that was my life growing up. But I learned the rule is money, that you think into the future. What you do today affects what's going to happen tomorrow, oftentimes. And money is something that must be managed. Now, if you go to poverty class, poverty, as I said, views only the now. But with money, the rule is money is something to be used and enjoyed, because you don't have it very often. So when you do have it, you can't think into the future. You're not trained to think that way. So you're like, I have money and right now. So think about this scenario. Let's say a guy goes to work. He earns his paycheck. His rent's due next Tuesday, but it's Friday night. And he goes and like, hey, man, I've had a hard week. I'm going to go party down. I'm going to have a good time. Let's say he spends so much money that he doesn't have the money to pay his rent on Tuesday. Now, the middle class looks at that and comes up with all sorts of judgment and says, that's irresponsible. He should have planned that out. And guess what? I understand that perspective. But here's what we fail to understand is that we will follow the hidden rules of society in which we were brought up in. So that guy, even though it's incredibly irresponsible to us, all he's doing is following the only rules by which he knows how to function.
Yes.
And so he's doing something that is incredibly irresponsible, but that's all he knows is how to use and enjoy money and survive in the moment. So if you want to lift somebody out of poverty, it's not just give them directions, is you have to help them understand and to think differently. So let me give you this wonderful scenario that I got to hear Ruby Payne in Memphis, Tennessee, and she told this wonderful story to illustrate this problem from the middle class to the wealthy class. She said, I'm a girl from the Midwest, and I'm just a middle class girl. And she said, but I have a friend who's on the Chicago Board of Trade, like homes in other countries, butler answering the door kind of wealth. And one day she heard, let's say this woman's name is Mary. I don't really remember. Mary was sick. So I baked Mary a casserole and I took it to Mary, and the butler answered the door. And I said, oh, I heard Mary was sick. I baked her this casserole. And the butler was very confused. So he invites her in, and Mary comes out of the bedroom and she said, oh, Mary, I heard you were sick. I baked you this casserole. Well, Mary is also very confused. And she tells the butler, well, I guess go put it in the kitchen. So a week later, she's not better, and Mary bakes her a cake. And the exact same thing happens. She takes her the cake, same confusion. Finally, a third person intervened that knew both of those women and said, said, Ruby, why are you trying to embarrass Mary? And she said, what do you mean? And she said, if Mary needs food, she'll send her servants to get food. Now, the lesson out of that is, everybody who's grown up in the middle class understands what the cake and the casserole represent.
Yep.
You're sick, you can't prepare food. I care about you. This is a way of expressing that I love you and I'm concerned about you. But what happens is when you take the rule that's very clear in one class system and you try to apply it to a different class system, whether you move up or down, that action or that the rules are different. So you can do the exact same thing, but if you do it outside of that those are the acceptable rules of your world, you will not communicate effectively and even cause harm. So lots of times you have people from middle-class environments that get people in poverty and they say, oh, come here, I'm going to teach you how to do right. You know how to do right. But they don't even know the rules by which they operate their lives. And it doesn't make those people less, but oftentimes we draw judgments from it and say, if somebody comes in here and so the best illustration I can use is to middle class. I say, imagine if you were in downtown Paris, France. I said, close your eyes. Now you open them. Imagine you're in downtown Paris, France, but you don't speak French. You don't have any friends. Mm-hmm. You don't have any money, nor do you even understand the monetary system. And so you're in a world in which it's very difficult to communicate. I said, what do you try to do? And usually, we talk about different things, and somebody says, well, I got to know where I'm going to sleep tonight. And I said, that's right. So instantly you start saying, hey, I got to survive. Where am I going to sleep tonight? Where's my next meal coming from? And guess what? You get up the next day and you do it all over again. And it doesn't mean because you're a bad person. It's you're trying to survive in a world in which you really do not know how to effectively navigate. And so what that person would need is not judgment, but understanding and help and compassion, but also a pathway forward. And that's where the accountability comes in. So it's incredibly challenging, but when you go into it from one class system to the other, whether you're going up or down, if you don't realize that those rules change and that their perspectives are vastly different, and it doesn't make theirs right or wrong, it makes it in accordance with their own systems, you're never going to make much progress in helping somebody transition into a healthier life. That's
a great story. And to your point too, most of us, hopefully, we start at a lower class because we're working, we're trying to find our feet, and we're trying to find our next job. And hopefully we're in a situation where we can go to school and things like that. And then you move up to that middle class and you do have more money to spend. And then you have to change your way of thinking. And then hopefully you get to a higher class where you have disposable income. And maybe, I think it's always interesting after the Great Depression. That's why so many people in the Great Depression never threw anything away. Our great-great-grandparents, they saved everything because they never knew if there was going to be another depression. They lived through that. And so they never really spent any of the money they ever made because they didn't know if they were going to have to go through it or not. So it's fantastic. Right. Mission Minded here with Michael Coleman, the executive director from the Jimmie Hale Mission, to show about non-for-profits. We talk about the Jimmie Hale Mission as well. I think it's really interesting. We talk about all non-for-profits here too, whether it's faith-based or whether it's a government agency. We can talk about boards. We talk about anything that is a non-for-profit. It doesn't always have to be some type of charity. I think about a program called Save the Hops. Do you remember Save the Hops? It came out about 20 years ago. It was basically a non-for-profit here in Birmingham that was created to ensure that eventually one day we could have microbrews and smaller batch beers that we could sell in the Birmingham area. It took years for this to happen, and now we've got so many microbrews and breweries out there. It's just it's incredibly crazy. And so their purpose was served, but the program and the organization still exist. They had to adapt to what their mission was and to who they were going to serve. And so I think it's interesting because, you talk about the men and women at the Jimmie Hale Mission and how it ebbs and flows. And you hope that you don't have nearly as many clients one day as you maybe have the next. Sure. And certainly you have an influx of people. So how do you deal with that when you have, and I think about the situation in the Ukraine as well. Poland has done a miraculous job, not only with their compassion and their sympathy and empathy and inviting Ukrainians in. We're certainly going to have that here, depending on I guess, this Prop 46, where we're going to be opening our country to 100,000 Ukrainians and certainly not as much as 3.5 million that Poland did. What happens when your numbers change dramatically one way or another, and how do you deal with it?
So, and we've touched briefly on some of this, but you'll see some of these same principles kind of coming in, things that we've touched on, but it's a great question and it's a real problem. So in that case, where if the public good or the community good that was being served was trying to bring about business through beer making and all of that, and I remember it, I don't remember that specific organization, But 20-something years ago, I was still on active duty. I was out in El Paso, Texas, and I remember guys like, "Hey, did you see Jim over there? Do you know Jim makes his own beer?" And everybody was trying out different things, and it was becoming just kind of real popular around the country. So I do remember that whole movement and the energy behind it. But like you said, when that public good is served, organizations are supposed to then either, if it's done, they are supposed to then dissolve in theory, or your mission is supposed to continue to make sure they're addressing a public need. If that public need goes away, and what you then you're that nonprofit is no longer needed in theory. And what usually ends up happening is when the public need is met, whatever you're fighting for, you begin to see there's nothing driving any staff, there's nothing driving the messaging, because it's not the urgency out there. You see money begin to dry up. As a matter of fact, about 10 years ago, the government passed a law, because there's so many nonprofits on the books. Mm-hmm. They passed a law that said, well, first of all, every nonprofit has to submit a 990, which basically lays out who your board is, lays out all your money. It's basically just calls for complete transparency, and you have to submit that, and you will actually be fined by the RS if you're late even a day as a nonprofit sending that in. However, if you go 3 straight years without submitting a 990, then your non-tax exemption is removed automatically. And so that's the way they're trying to clean up a lot of these nonprofits and get rid of them. But going back to your original question, what do you do? I believe my approach to this is, now of course we deal with the human element. Yeah. And we know we're never going to totally solve the problem of homelessness, because you have brokenness in mankind. That's just who we are. Mm-hmm. And that's going to manifest itself in many different ways, to include addiction and homelessness and all the conditions we have. What I feel like is the greatest responsibility of me and my board is to make sure that we don't wait for that event to happen. We don't wait for irrelevance to be made known through donations. Because if you've waited that long, you've likely waited too long to turn the ship around. Yeah. So what we do is we do critical assessments all the time, and everything gets put under the microscope to see whether it's effective or not. And if it's not effective, if it's not helping us accomplish our mission, we jettison it right away. And so we're constantly pruning, just like you would a healthy bush. We're constantly pruning and massaging and doing all those things we can to make sure we're staying relevant. And if and just go back to earlier in the show when I was talking about Jesse's Place, we desperately want to help women and children. Well, guess what we found out? Economy's good. A lot of people are working. Maybe there's not a huge demand for homeless care for women and mm-hmm. children. I'm not saying that there's no reason for it, but there's a few shelters that do that. Yeah. What we found is that there's a greater demand for women caught in addiction. And so we began to shift. We shifted Jesse's Place to addiction recovery, which coincides with what we're doing with the men, which helps us, because then that just further tightens our whole organizational mission and purpose. But we did that based on the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground is we had a staff to address the need, and that need, at least right now, was not an overwhelming need in our community. So you have to see that, and you have to be nimble enough, and that goes back to budgeting, that goes back to how you staff, how you organize, all that kind of stuff. But you have to be nimble enough that you can transition with a little different focus, but still help the most amount of people.
That is really, really interesting, and that's incredible that you would think, they have the forethought to think through that before those things would happen, and that's why obviously the Jimmie Hale Mission does a wonderful job. Mission Minded here with Michael Coleman, the executive director from the Jimmie Hale Mission. We talk about NFPs and talk about all kinds of business decisions that can make your non-for-profit even more successful. So a couple of questions, and we have several people here in the studio listening to the show. First of all, if you do have a non-for-profit and for whatever reason your non-for-profit no longer has a service and you still have money in your coffers, what happens to that money? First question.
It's always a board decision. And so I will give you a good example. Churches, if you meet the IRS qualification for a church, which is you have to have a lead pastor or a key representative, and you have to have an audience or a congregation. So there's legal specifications. But when a church closes, and we've had this happen before, it just ages out or whatever. We see that very common. Well, they've been holding on to money for years and years and years. So we've had churches that said, hey, we're closing the door. We just can't keep it open. We're an older congregation. We're going to blend in with this, but we have $20,000 just sitting in the bank. We want to make a donation to you. And so when a church or a nonprofit, you take whatever assets you have, and then you have to transfer those into another good work, and then you kind of close it all out, and you make your notification to the IRS. You are no longer, a reporting entity. You can dissolve it, and this is what you did with your assets. And so it's really up to the board to figure out where they can best do that. And it's oftentimes a pretty sad time because they're shutting down a work, and that work may have been dynamic in its time, but it's just no longer effective. But yeah, I've been involved in that on a couple of occasions where people have done that.
Another situation I think is really interesting is when you are counting on financial assistance, whether it be from government agencies or anything else, based on a number of clientele that you're serving, then all of a sudden you don't have that number anymore. So you don't deserve the same amount of money coming in, but you're also running a non-for-profit that serves employees. So you're in a situation where I guess you have to cut back, right?
Yeah. So as a matter of fact, I was just talking this over with a guy who's in that situation. He is not getting as many clients. So on one hand, he's glad that there's not as much need. However, he gets funded based on how many people he serves. And so he's not maxing out his capability, which hurts him. And let's say he's hired, let's just say 3 counselors, but now he only has the money for 2 counselors. This is the danger of delivering a public good or service to the public and just relying on government grants to do it. So we've talked about this before in previous episodes, that there's you can be a nonprofit and basically your finance and your budget is controlled. You don't drive the mission. The mission is controlled by the funds you get and the rules that come with that. And so you're basically an extension of that government agency with some freedoms, but basically you have, since they control the purse strings, they're going to control that organization.
That's really interesting.
But even if you have that situation, what is always best to do, if you get the right leader and you get that leader to be able to take that and build an outside influence, an outside following, because if you're truly doing a public good and you're really changing lives, that leader should be able to sell that. What I have found is in my history is lots of times you get somebody who's introverted, doesn't know how to fundraise, is not interested in fundraising. So they don't have to fundraise in those kind of organizations. The downside is they're just there to whatever they get. But then when you have a situation like that, then you're caught off guard, and then you can't people's jobs are affected, the mission is affected, and all that. So I always encourage people, regardless if your whole program is funded, you still need to build a following. You still need to have donors, because that gives you the freedom and luxury and the ability to expand your mission, to cover down on those rainy day opportunities. And in the sense of you did lose people, so you're not getting as much funded here, you don't have to lay a really important member of your staff off because you have this little nest egg, if you will, kind of built up for that. And but again, when you do that, that's calling a lot of people out to do things that they either are not equipped to do or just don't desire to do.
Michael, we're about out of time, but we already spoke prior to doing the show about what we want to get into next week. And I think it's really interesting because you mentioned so many addictive properties come into play when you're talking about people being homeless and trying to get better motivationally, physically, and spiritually, the whole 9 yards of what the Jimmie Hale Mission does. But I want to get into that next week. We probably get a couple of shows out of it because I've been through the process, and I know being an addict or being an alcoholic and having those properties, that's a whole nother problem. It really is. And obviously you have clientele where they've lost quite a bit because they're homeless and they're looking for that spiritual guidance. So we're going to get into that coming up next week. I think it's going to be because I want to know exactly what kind of resources you use in order to get that. And I think you mentioned earlier in the show about a 4-month program, and I'd love to hear all about that. God bless you, man. Great show, as always.
Looking forward to it. I think it'll be a great show, and thanks to everybody for listening.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you. We'll talk next week.
Okay, brother.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.